The music was a cruel, thumping drumbeat in the cold night air. I had just driven 8 painful hours through the darkness, the engine heat barely cutting through the shame that had become my constant companion, shame that had no reason to exist, yet had somehow become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. I had driven all those miles because I believed, with a desperation that now felt foolish, that this year would be different. This year, my family would finally include me in something that mattered to them. I parked my old sedan near the grand entrance of the Lakeshore Country Club, a place that had never welcomed people like me, people who worked for a living, people whose hands bore the stains of labor rather than the marks of inherited privilege. The lights of my sister Scarlett's birthday party spilled like liquid gold across the white gravel driveway, and I could hear the distant laughter of people who belonged in such places. I sat for a moment, gathering courage, then stepped out and adjusted the neckline of a borrowed velvet dress. Borrowed, because I couldn't afford new clothes, not really, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just as I started toward those imposing doors, they flew open with theatrical timing that seemed almost choreographed. But it wasn't Scarlett who emerged. It was my mother, Joyce, her face arranged in an expression I had come to know well over the years, the face of someone caught between social obligation and genuine disdain. She didn't look happy to see me. She didn't even look neutral. She looked annoyed, the way one might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. She marched toward me across the driveway, stopping directly in my path. Her face, usually soft with a carefully practiced social smile reserved for her country club friends, was hard as stone. The transformation was complete, as if she had switched masks the moment she stepped outside into the privacy of the night. "You really should have called, Rory," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, low whisper, the kind of whisper that is meant to wound more than a shout ever could. "This is a private party. We can't have you upsetting the atmosphere." She didn't invite me in. She didn't apologize for the lack of invitation. She simply stood there, using her body like a shield, like a fortress wall between me and the warmth inside. I could see the heads of guests turning, their smiles fading into curiosity. I could see the phones emerging from designer handbags. This wasn't a private rejection. It was a public execution, carefully orchestrated and absolutely deliberate. The final public humiliation stole the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was feel the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes, all of them seeing me as my family had always seen me, as the mistake, the failure, the impractical one. My name is Aurora, Rory to those who know me, and I use that name rarely because few people truly know me at all. I am 31 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life as a ghost haunting the periphery of my family's perfect, glittering world. They allow my ghost to exist, but they would prefer it if I didn't make any noise, didn't ask for anything, and certainly didn't show up uninvited to their carefully curated events. My specialized work is chemical conservation science. I spend my days, and many of my nights, saving priceless historical textiles and ancient documents from falling apart. It's work that requires precision, patience, and a deep understanding of chemistry and molecular biology. It's work that has been published in peer-reviewed journals. It's work that matters, that preserves human history for future generations. But to my family, it is merely dusty old messes. Dusty, old, messes. 3 words that somehow summarized their entire dismissal of everything I had accomplished. My sister Scarlett, on the other hand, was the glamorous one. Scarlett had the face, the figure, the confidence, and most importantly, the gift for making money. She had started what was essentially a decorative clothing line, and somehow, through a combination of marketing genius and sheer luck, she had turned it into an empire. Scarlett made them proud. Scarlett made them money. Scarlett was everything a daughter should be, at least in their estimation. I backed away slowly from my mother, gravel crunching beneath my cheap heels. shoes I had bought at a discount store because I counted every penny. Joyce watched me retreat, her expression never softening, her face a portrait of victory. It was a win for her, this moment. She had humiliated me in front of witnesses, and there was nothing I could do about it. I was simply the impractical sister. After all, why would anyone care about my feelings? I made it to my car with my vision blurred by unshed tears. I drove away from the country club, away from the warmth and laughter, into the cold night. A few miles down the road, my hands began to shake so violently that I had to pull over. I gripped the steering wheel and allowed myself to shake, to hurt, to feel the accumulated weight of every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I had been less than not enough, not quite right. I remembered a similar cruel moment from when I was 16 years old. I had won the state science fair. Not just won, but placed first with a project on textile preservation that had impressed even the judges who had seen hundreds of entries. It was the proudest moment of my young life. I had called my father, Arthur, from the school to tell him I needed a ride home. I was floating. I was euphoric. I was imagining him standing in the audience, finally seeing what I could do, finally understanding that I was worth something. He didn't show up. When I finally got home many hours later, exhausted and confused, he was there, but he didn't even ask about the competition. He simply said, "Well, Scarlett's thing was more important, Rory. It involved people." Scarlett's thing was a booth for a high school fundraiser. A booth. He had been helping her set up a booth while his daughter won the state science fair. Their cruelty, I realized as I sat in my car on the side of the road, was never a storm. It was never a sudden, dramatic thing that happened once and then passed. It was a slow, persistent drizzle of neglect that fell day after day, year after year. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small rejections, 1,000 moments of being deprioritized, of being the second choice, the third choice, the choice you made when nothing better was available. And like water wearing away at stone, it had eroded my self-worth until I felt small and useless and somehow deserving of exactly this treatment. I sat there in the dark for a long time. And then, slowly, as the shock began to fade and the hurt began to crystallize into something harder, something sharper, I started to think. I started to remember the core of my family's wealth, the true source of what would become Scarlett's international fame and fortune, was something called the Everlast pigment. It was a unique textile dye that never faded, never ran, and could withstand incredible heat and washing. In an industry built on colors that gradually oxidized and faded, becoming dull and lifeless over time, this was revolutionary. This was the kind of discovery that could change everything. Arthur, my father, was brilliant at marketing. He could take a scientific innovation and spin it into pure gold, could convince investors that they were buying not just a product, but a vision of the future. He had co-patented the Everlast pigment, claiming to be the visionary behind it, the genius who had dreamed it up and brought it to life. But here is the truth that only I knew. I was the one who had spent hundreds of hours in the lab during my college years doing the actual heavy lifting. While Arthur networked and schmoozed and planned his future, I was there at 3 a.m. running experiments, testing molecular structures, solving the problems that no one else could solve. The challenge wasn't creating the pigment itself. It was making it stable. Arthur's original formula was volatile, beautiful, but unstable, like holding fire in your hands. The colors were vivid, but the dye degraded under heat and light. I fixed that. Through painstaking work, through trial and error, through a deep understanding of chemistry and molecules, and the way things broke down at the atomic level, I created the stabilization compound that made Arthur's pigment usable. I transformed his idea into something that actually worked. I gave his dream its foundation. And for this, I received a 5% stake in the patent. Not 5% of the profits, not 5% of the company. 5% of the patent itself, non-transferable, with no exit clause. My parents and sister had referred to this stake as a nuisance for years now. A nuisance, as if my work, my brilliance, my contributions were merely an inconvenience they had to tolerate. My life had become defined by the limitations they placed on me. 5 years ago, Arthur had helped me buy a small, specialized lab space. I say helped, but what he actually did was finance it with a ridiculously short-term, massive balloon payment on the mortgage. The payment was due in 6 months, and Arthur was my guarantor. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the power it gave him over me? It meant that every day I existed at his pleasure. It meant that if I fought them, if I stood up for myself, if I demanded the respect I deserved, my father could simply let the payment lapse. He could walk away. And I would lose the only place where I felt safe, the only place where I felt competent, the only place where I felt like myself. My lab was my sanctuary. It was the one place on earth where I knew exactly what I was doing, where my intelligence was not mocked, but required, where my hands created something real and true. So Arthur had me shackled, not with chains, but with financial desperation. It was even more effective than chains. Scarlett, meanwhile, was preparing for something that my entire family talked about in hushed, reverent tones, the launch of Scarlett Luxe textiles. The brand was entirely, completely built on the Everlast pigment. She had designed beautiful garments using the pigment, had built marketing campaigns around it, had positioned herself as the creative genius behind the entire enterprise. This was going to be her moment to ascend to the level of international mogul, to join the ranks of fashion icons and business titans whose names appeared in Forbes and Vogue and on the covers of business magazines. She and Joyce were planning a lavish, televised launch event in New York City. It would be broadcast live to millions of people around the world. Serious investors had already committed serious money. It was the kind of event that could change lives. At least it would change Scarlett's life. But my 5%, while small, gave me something they desperately wanted: control. Not over the profits, but over the narrative. If I refused to sign away my stake, if I made noise about the patent, I could potentially derail the entire launch. They had spent the last 6 months pushing me hard to sign it away for a pittance designed to make me feel grateful for their generosity. They wanted me gone. They wanted me erased. They wanted to rewrite the history of the Everlast pigment, to exclude my name entirely. On the drive back from the country club that night, with my hands still shaking and my heart still broken, I made a decision. I would not be erased. I would not disappear quietly into the night like a good little ghost. I would not give them the satisfaction of my surrender. Instead, I would build something better, something they could never take away from me. I returned to my lab early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen. The cool, sterile environment had the effect it always did. It calmed my frantic thoughts. It slowed my racing heart. It brought me back into the present moment where my mind was clear and focused. I made strong coffee and pulled up the original, dense patent documents for the Everlast pigment. I had read them 100 times before, but this time I wasn't looking for legal phrasing or patent language or loopholes. I was looking at the chemical structure. I was reading my own language, the language of molecules and reactions, of atoms and bonds, of the way that matter transformed under pressure and heat. I had done the stabilization work years ago during those intense college years, when I had barely slept and barely eaten, when I had lived in the lab like it was my second home. I remembered every molecule, every experiment, every failed attempt that had led me closer to the solution. My brain, the thing they mocked as impractical, started working in high gear, moving through the documents like a chess player analyzing a game they had played decades ago. And then I found it. It was buried deep in the supplementary chemical notes that only a conservation scientist would ever need to read, the kind of technical appendix that most people would skip over entirely. It was there because I had put it there, documenting my work, being thorough and precise the way that good scientists are supposed to be. The chemical instability clause. It wasn't a flaw in the primary dye itself. Arthur's original pigment was stable enough, the colors were vivid, and they would stay vivid, at least under normal conditions. But the real work, the real artistry, had been in creating a secondary binding agent that would anchor the pigment to the fabric and prevent degradation. That binding agent was where the instability lived. Here is what I had discovered. All those years ago, if the pigment was exposed to a very specific, high-frequency UV wavelength, not regular sunlight, not ordinary indoor lighting, but a very particular frequency found primarily in certain industrial and retail display lights, for exactly 72 cumulative hours, a chain reaction would occur. The chemical bonds would begin to break down. The color molecules would rapidly and irreversibly degrade. The beautiful, vibrant fabric would transform into dull, worthless gray powder. The everlast would become the uneverlast. This was the secret that nobody knew. Arthur hadn't understood the chemistry. He had barely understood the basics. He only cared about the profit, about the marketing, about the vision of himself as a visionary. Joyce cared about status and social standing. Scarlett cared about fame and fortune. None of them had cared about the actual science. I had stabilized Arthur's volatile formula as much as I possibly could with the resources I had available to me back then, but I couldn't eliminate the latent flaw without completely redesigning the pigment from the ground up, something I hadn't had the resources or the time to do. So I had documented it. I had buried the knowledge deep in the technical appendix, and I had hoped that they would never expose the pigment to that specific frequency of light. And for years, they hadn't. The pigment had remained stable, had performed beautifully, had made them money, and given them status. But this was a ticking time bomb, and I held the only key. I called Mr. Finn, the retired family attorney, the one person in my family's entire world that I actually trusted. He was old school, sharp, and he had never fallen for Arthur's charm or Joyce's social posturing. He had watched the family's dysfunction play out over decades, and he had a deep, quiet disdain for their manipulative tactics. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I didn't even let him say hello before I started talking. Mr. Finn, I have found a fatal, time-sensitive flaw in the Everlast patent. I need to patent the stabilization compound that prevents this flaw. I need this done quickly under a new LLC. I need to move fast before my family figures out what I'm doing. He paused. A long silence stretched across the phone line, and I could almost hear him thinking, calculating, understanding the implications of what I was telling him. "Rory," he finally said, his voice low with respect. "You found the atom bomb in the flower garden. I'll get the paperwork started immediately. Call your new company Aura Labs, LLC. Aura, my middle name. A name that meant light, that meant radiation, that meant everything I was, and everything they had never allowed me to be. How fast can you move?" I asked. "We have 48 hours before the launch, don't we?" he said. "I'll work through the night. You focus on the science. We'll handle the legal." I worked nonstop for 36 hours in my lab, the place that had been my refuge and my prison. I synthesized the precise, complex compound needed to prevent the UV degradation. It wasn't just recreating what I had done years ago. It was improving upon it, making it stronger, making it unbreakable. Every molecule I manipulated felt like a small act of reclamation, like I was taking back something that had been stolen from me. It was a scientific masterpiece, built entirely from the knowledge they had ignored, the brilliance they had mocked, the contributions they had diminished. I secured the patent for the stabilization compound under Aura Labs, LLC. I now legally owned the only insurance policy against their total financial ruin. I was no longer a ghost haunting the periphery of their world. I was a force of nature, and they had no idea what was coming. To cement my position, I needed to know their plans in detail. And then, as if the universe had decided to help me, Scarlett called. "Rory," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The investors want full transparency. They need to see your bank records. Your little investment account needs to be tidy. Stop being so difficult. Can you send that over today?" I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I kept my voice gentle and compliant. "Of course," I said softly. "I'll email them over this afternoon." But before I sent those records, I looked at their ledger, and what I found made everything click into place. There was a massive, recent expense, the purchase of an extensive set of high-powered, high-UV retail display lights for the New York launch. Lights specifically designed to make colors pop, to create dramatic visual impact, to spotlight the beauty of the fabrics. They were walking straight into the trap, and they were paying for the privilege. I started putting on an elaborate performance of collapse. It was acting, but it was good acting, the kind that comes from deep observation of human nature and the understanding of what people wanted to see. When Joyce called, I would speak softly, my voice trembling, claiming that I was overwhelmed by my lab work and couldn't handle the big decisions like the patent sale. When Scarlett texted, I took hours to respond, and when I did, I used vague, uncertain language. I even started neglecting my appearance, just enough for them to notice and feel superior. I wore the same lab coat multiple times in a row. I stopped putting on makeup. I let my hair fall limp and unstyled around my face. They needed to believe I was emotionally shattered, ready to surrender everything, ready to give up without a fight. The more helpless I seemed, the more arrogant they became. The more they believed they had won. Arthur called me, with barely concealed glee in his voice. "Look, Rory," he said, his tone sharp and impatient. "Just take the money. This is your last chance. We need you out of the way before the New York event. Once we sign, you can retire or whatever you want to do with yourself. Just take the money and disappear." "Okay," I whispered. "I'll do it. I need time." "You have 1 week," he said. "After that, the offer expires." The launch date was set for 2 weeks away. Scarlett sent me an embossed invitation, thick, expensive cardstock with gold lettering. It was the first time I had ever been invited to one of her major events. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a demand for my presence as a prop, a visual contrast to her brilliance, the plain sister against whom Scarlett's beauty would shine all the brighter. I knew I wouldn't go to New York. The climax couldn't be witnessed by me in person, tucked away in the audience somewhere. No, this moment had to be witnessed by millions of people all around the world. It had to be public and undeniable and absolutely devastating. It had to be the kind of moment that couldn't be spun or explained away or covered up. Arthur, completely oblivious to the chemical bomb ticking beneath his prized pigment like a second heartbeat, called to set a final meeting to sign the buyout papers. His voice was triumphant. "Look, Rory," he said again, as if repetition would make it true. "Just take the money. This is your last chance. We need you out of the way before the New York event." I agreed to meet him at his office. I hung up the phone and looked at myself in the mirror. I was still Rory, the impractical one, the one who had been dismissed and diminished for so long. But I was also Aurora, the architect of her own liberation, the woman who had just set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The meeting took place in Arthur's corner office on the 35th floor of a downtown building. Everything about it was designed to intimidate: the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive furniture, the impressive view of the city sprawling out below us. Arthur sat behind his mahogany desk like a king on a throne, and he pushed the documents toward me with a gold pen. I saw the relief in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought I was finally broken, finally ready to surrender. I looked him dead in the eye, my hands trembling slightly, some of it for effect, some of it genuine. And I signed the documents. I signed away my 5%. But just before I handed them back across the desk, I asked a seemingly innocent scientific question. I mentioned very specifically an undocumented heat treatment I had once performed on the binding agent years ago. I phrased it as if I was worried they might have forgotten about it, as if I was concerned about something technical and unimportant. Arthur scoffed, taking the signed papers from my hands. We use the standard industrial process. Rory, your little tweaks don't matter anymore. You're out. You're done. He actually smiled. He actually looked happy. And as he turned to put the papers in his desk drawer, I discreetly left a small, sealed, unmarked envelope under his heavy mahogany paperweight. Inside was a highly technical, single-page printout from Aura Labs, LLC. It showed the precise UV light frequency of their new display lights and the time-sensitive degradation point of the Everlast pigment. It was written in language so technical, so dense with chemistry jargon, that only someone with a deep scientific background would understand it. I knew he wouldn't read it. He would see it, would assume it was just my irrelevant scientific rambling, and he would throw it away or file it somewhere it would never see the light of day. After all, he was the visionary. He was the one who knew what mattered and what didn't. But I had another move in play. Mr. Finn, acting on my instructions, sent a final, complex legal letter to the International IP office and to Arthur's business address. The letter cited the potential for instability in the pigment under specific, extreme light conditions. It was not a direct threat. It was carefully worded to be technically accurate without being accusatory. It was filed under the name of an anonymous, concerned IP holder. Arthur, thinking it was a competitor trying to sabotage him, immediately hired an expensive, clumsy defense team to fight the invisible threat. He spent a fortune in legal fees, and he diverted his attention completely from the real problem. His people called meetings. They discussed strategy. They prepared briefs. All of this was excellent for my purposes. It kept him distracted, kept him focused on fighting the wrong battle. The day before the launch, I received a torrent of angry, desperate messages from Scarlett. They came in rapid succession, each one more frantic than the last. Rory, why are they auditing us? This is your doing. Stop trying to ruin me. You always were jealous of what I've built. If you don't fix this, I swear I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. Please, please, just tell them to stop. I read these messages with a strange sense of detachment. Scarlett had never once asked me how I was doing. She had never congratulated me on my scientific achievements. She had spent her entire life dismissing my work and my worth. And now, when she needed me, when she was finally desperate enough to reach out, her desperation came clothed in anger and threats. I simply blocked her number. I was done with their abuse. I was done with their frantic attempts to make me their scapegoat. The anger in her texts was the music of my freedom. I realized in that moment how completely dependent they were on my silence, how much power I actually had, how much I had always had. I had just never known how to use it. That evening, I got a call from Julia, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years. Julia had been Scarlett's best friend in high school, had attended the country club with them, had watched me being dismissed from the inside of their social circle. I was surprised to hear from her, but I answered. "Rory," she said, and I could hear genuine worry in her voice. "I'm attending the launch tomorrow, and I'm worried." Scarlett mentioned something about a warning from Arthur, something about the lights. Arthur told her to ignore it, said he'd already hired people to handle it. But Scarlett is terrified. She's been crying all day. Arthur is saying that they're just going to use the strongest spotlights anyway, the most intense lights they have, because the colors need to pop for the cameras. Does that make sense to you? I closed my eyes. I knew exactly what she was telling me. Arthur had received the technical letter. He had interpreted it as a competitive threat, and in his arrogance, in his absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone else, he had decided to ignore it. He was going to use the brightest, most intense lights available, which would include exactly the high-frequency UV wavelength that would trigger the degradation. And they would expose the fabrics to these lights for the entire 72-hour installation and display period, pushing the material past the point of no return. The final critical decision had been made. They chose arrogance over science. They chose their pride over precaution. "Julia," I said softly, "thank you for calling. I appreciate you." And then I hung up the phone. The launch day arrived, brilliant and clear and perfect in every way. The New York weather had cooperated beautifully. Blue sky, perfect lighting, the kind of day that was made for major televised events. I sat alone in my lab, watching the live global stream on my computer. There were 17 million people watching around the world. 17 million people who were about to witness something they would never forget. Scarlett took the stage at precisely 2 p.m. Eastern Time. She was stunning in a custom-made dress that probably cost more than my entire yearly salary. She gave a long, self-congratulatory speech, thanking everyone who had supported her vision. She thanked her investors. She thanked the design team. She thanked the photographers and the publicists and the marketing team. She gave full credit to Arthur for the visionary chemistry behind the pigment. She didn't thank me. She didn't mention me. She didn't acknowledge my existence in any way. I felt no anger, only a detached sense of finality. It was time. It was time for the universe to correct itself. The moment came. Scarlett, smiling triumphantly, held her hands out as the massive, ornate curtains began to be drawn back. The camera panned across the display. Yards and yards of the most beautiful fabrics, all in the signature colors that had made the brand famous. Deep reds, rich sapphires, shimmering golds, all of it positioned directly under the intense, high-powered retail lights. The camera zoomed in for the close-up shot of the fabrics, the moment when the world would see the legendary colors of the Everlast pigment up close. But something was wrong. The vibrant color was gone. In real time, on the massive stage, in front of 17 million viewers, the reds looked like faded brick dust. The deep sapphire was a dirty gray, like something that had been left in the sun for decades. The shimmering gold was a dull, powdery yellow. The fabrics were literally crumbling, the color molecules breaking apart before the cameras and the audience and the watching world. The instability clause had triggered. The pigment had failed dramatically. The Everlast textiles had lasted less than 3 days under the lights. Scarlett's smile froze on her face. I watched it happen in real time on my computer screen, watched her expression transform from triumph to confusion to horror. She looked at the worthless, ruined fabric in her hands, and the smile became a mask, a terrible grimace of pure terror. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she looked like she might faint. The orchestra music that had been playing stopped abruptly. A horrified silence fell over the New York audience. The camera operators, unsure what to do, kept filming, and the world watched as everything fell apart. The total collapse was immediate and overwhelming. The stock market reacted instantly, dropping the share price of Scarlett Luxe Textiles from $58 per share to pennies within an hour. The investors, who had just been televised watching the failure, sued immediately. They filed lawsuits for fraud, for misleading statements, for breach of contract. The International IP Office, which had been monitoring the situation, quietly, formally voided the patent based on the public, documented material failure of the product. Arthur's expensive defense team, realizing they had been fighting the wrong battle, abandoned him. They issued statements distancing themselves from the company and its leadership. Scarlett was stripped of her title, her investors, and her reputation. She became, overnight, a symbol of arrogance and failure. Within 72 hours, they had lost everything. The grand estate was seized to cover Arthur's mounting legal debts. Joyce disappeared into silence, no longer able to maintain her perfect social facade. Scarlett became the cautionary tale that everyone told, the brilliant young woman who had been brought down by her own hubris. But the story doesn't end with their destruction. That's only the beginning of my liberation. Aura Labs LLC was flooded with desperate inquiries from textile companies around the world. Suddenly, every company that had ever worked with synthetic pigments faced a crisis of confidence. What if their products had the same instability? What if they were sitting on time bombs like the Everlast pigment? The entire industry held its breath and waited for Aura Labs. I sold the exclusive global license for the stabilization compound for a colossal sum, $47 million, enough to make me financially independent for life, enough to ensure that I would never again be financially shackled to anyone. I used the money to pay off the mortgage on my lab, officially freeing myself from Arthur's grasp. My sanctuary was now truly mine. No balloon payment, no guarantor. No one could take it away from me. I never called my family. I never wrote them a letter. I never looked back. I don't know what happened to them after that first terrible year. And I didn't want to know. They had built their empire on borrowed brilliance and inherited privilege, and it had crumbled in front of the entire world. That was enough. The last I heard through the kind of distant gossip that filters through scientific communities, the grand estate was being seized by creditors. The country club had quietly removed their name from the membership rolls. Joyce had retreated into complete isolation. Scarlett had attempted to rebuild, but no one would work with her. No one would trust her. No one would associate their name with hers. Arthur, the visionary, had become a cautionary tale, a brilliant marketer who had built an empire on the work of others, only to watch it collapse because he had refused to listen to the one person who actually understood the science. And me, I walked into my new life, not as the forgotten sister, not as the ghost haunting the periphery of their world, but as Aura, the brilliant scientist who had saved the very industry they tried to control. I had become exactly what I was always meant to be, indispensable. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. Did I destroy my family? Did I manipulate them? Did I play God with their fate? No, I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves. I simply removed the rose-tinted glasses and let them see the world as it actually was. I didn't manipulate them. I responded to their actions with scientific precision and cold logic. And I didn't play God. I simply understood chemistry better than they did. And I used that understanding to protect myself. Is that revenge? Perhaps. But it's the kind of revenge that the universe provides when you finally stop running away from your own power and start running toward it instead. My lab is still my sanctuary, but now it's also my kingdom. I have trained the best minds in textile conservation. I have published papers that are changing the entire industry. I have saved historical artifacts that would have been lost forever. And I did it all without them. Some nights, I still think about that moment at the country club when my mother stood in the driveway and told me I wasn't welcome. I think about how small I felt, how insignificant, how disposable. But then I remember that woman was terrified of losing her status. She was so afraid that she had to destroy me just to maintain the illusion of her own importance. And I felt sorry for her. Truly, genuinely sorry. Because she had spent her whole life worrying about what other people thought, about maintaining a facade, about never being truly seen or truly known. I had been broken, but that had set me free. I had been dismissed, but that had forced me to find my own voice. I had been erased, but that had given me the power to rewrite my own story. The music that was once cruel has become the soundtrack to my freedom, and I dance to it every single day. I receive an email from Mr. Finn. There's a request from a film studio interested in optioning my story. They want to make it into a movie. They want to tell the world about the woman who rewrote her own destiny. I almost say no, but then I realize the story isn't about them anymore. It never was. It's about me. It's about every person who has ever been told they weren't enough, that they weren't the right kind of smart, that their work didn't matter, that their contributions were a nuisance. It's about every person who had to take the long road to understanding their own worth. I tell Mr. Finn to pursue it, because maybe, just maybe, someone will see themselves in my story. Someone will realize that their power doesn't come from the approval of others. It comes from within. It comes from understanding your own gifts and having the courage to use them, even when the entire world tells you that you're wrong, that you're broken, that you'll never be enough. My name is Aurora Hartley. I am the architect of my own liberation. And my story is far from over. It's just beginning. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. They called my chemical science useless, claiming I would upset the atmosphere. But my story proves that silence can be a weapon, and specialized patience is power. Your worth isn't defined by who gets the credit or who your family chooses to believe first. If this resonated, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries and turning humiliation into triumph. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending, proving that your expertise was never in question.